Hey everybody, welcome to Flyin Miata. My name is Kyle, and today we're installing a muffler, midpipe, and Hush-o-matic can controller on an ND Miata. Alright, before we get started, let's go over some of the components of the kits. We're going to start with the Hush-o-matic muffler. We have the muffler itself, as well as the vacuum line for the actuator, a new gasket, some zip ties, and fitting. Next we have our midpipe. It comes in 3 pieces, so we have some clamps to join it, as well as some hardware and a gasket to put it all together. And over here is our can controller for the Hush-o-matic muffler. It includes a solenoid, the appropriate fittings and plumbing for the vacuum and electrical, as well as the little brain that controls it all. So we'll show you how to install that all now. Alright, step 1 is to get your car safely supported. We've done that here, so we're going to go ahead and move on to the midpipe installation. Now we're working on almost a brand new car, so we're not too worried about seized fasteners. But if you live in a rusty state or on an older car, you may consider spraying down your fasteners with some penetrating oil first. So let's go ahead and get started. Step 1 for the midpipe is to remove the 2 aluminum braces. Now there are a couple slots cut in them, so you don't have to remove all the fasteners fully. I'm going to go ahead and leave a couple of them in place. You'll see that. Now we have full access to the exhaust. Our next step is to get the oxygen sensor unplugged. Now you can remove the oxygen sensor fully now, or you can leave the sensor installed into the midpipe and remove it once the midpipe is out of the car. I'm going to go ahead and opt for that option. Now we're ready to actually remove the midpipe. Impact guns can easily round off the fasteners, so we're going to go ahead and start breaking them loose with a hand wrench. It's a 14mm socket. Go and loosen the ones at the back as well. Now that they're broken loose, I can hit them with an impact. It's common for the entire stud to come off, along with the spring. That's okay. Depending on your muffler installation, this is actually desirable, but we'll address that when we get to that point. Same type of thing happens here. Sometimes the studs will come out. We'll address that later. At this point, we're hanging on the stud up here, and we have a suspension hanger here. The next step is to remove the suspension hanger. We want to remove it off of the exhaust pipe, leaving it attached to the subframe. They can be a little sticky, so we're going to spray it with a lubricant, in this case Simple Green. WD-40 works as well. And then using either channel locks or pliers, you can, or a pry bar, you can find a way to lever against it to get the bushing off. Now be careful that your front end doesn't drop. So I'm holding some pressure to keep it mounted onto this stud. Sometimes a second set of hands can be helpful as well. So now I'm going to lower the back and let it fall off the stud on the front. And that's the midpipe. While I remove the midpipe, our donut gasket on the front fell off. Make sure not to lose it or damage it, because we do reuse it in this case. So I'll set it aside for now. Now it's time to remove the oxygen sensor from the midpipe so we can transfer it to the new one. Now remember on that forward flange when the nut and the stud came out together, the reason we don't want to put that back in as is the new midpipe has a thicker flange and there will be less thread engagement on the stud. So I'm going to go ahead and jam nut the other end of the stud so I can remove the nut that's stuck. All right, we're ready. Before we put anything together, we want to decide where to put our oxygen sensor. Now this is the post-cat oxygen sensor because the primary cat is in the manifold. We recommend you using the original location, which is just forward of the secondary cat here. We do have an alternative location, which is after the secondary cat. You might use that if you use a header that got rid of the primary catalytic converter. So we're going to go ahead and install it into our forward pipe, and then we'll get this put into the car. The threads of our oxygen sensor are a little bit dry, so I'm going to go ahead and put a little dab of anti-seize on them. Then we can get threaded into that pipe. There we go. Now before I'm putting this in, I went ahead and got my stud reinstalled and also got the gasket put back into place. So now let's mount this up with the original nuts. Now I'm going to get these tightened up just a little bit. I still want to have some play in the pipe. Still have a little bit of play so it can maneuver, but it's not quite so droopy, and that also keeps our gasket from falling off out of the front. Now since we opted to put our sensor in that forward pipe, we need to go ahead and plug the unused bung location. Using the provided bung plug, I've added a tiny bit of anti-seize, and it takes a 10mm Allen to thread it into place. Before we put our center section on, let's go ahead and preload the clamp. Orientation's not super critical. Get it installed about halfway, and then you can feed in the forward end of the pipe. And then we'll lift this end up and feed it into the bushing. Now be careful here because it's possible the front could slip out of the clamp. So let's have that be our next step to snug this up so it doesn't fall. Don't worry about getting it super tight yet because we'll probably loosen this back up when we go to orient all of our pipes. We just don't want it to fall out. At this point, the hardware in the gasket that's used is dependent on the mid-pipe that you're using. If you are using our mid-pipe, it comes with a new flat gasket, new studs, and new nuts. If you are reusing the stock mid-pipe, our muffler comes with a new gasket because in our experience, reusing this gasket almost always results in a leak, and you are going to reuse the Mazda muffler hardware. Now this step is for those who are keeping their stock muffler. In that case, you're going to use the supplied hardware, supplied studs, and feed them into the muffler. And you can see on the back side here, I get them to where they're just sticking through the nut. We're now going to use the flat gasket. And the last section of the mid-pipe and its clamp. I'm going to get it on there so the gasket doesn't fall off, and then I can maneuver it to where these join together. And get that snugged up a little bit so it doesn't fall apart. Let's move on to buttoning up the oxygen sensor. We no longer have a mounting point for this flange here, and we want to make sure the wire stays away from the cat as it gets really hot. So we're going to go ahead and use this bolt here that also mounts the connector. So step one is first see if your flange reaches it. We don't want to be pulling on the wires. You can see ours is a little bit short. So just take a screwdriver, flat blade screwdriver, pry open that clamp a little bit, careful not to damage the wires. I can then move the clamp down, and now we line up with slack to spare. So let's go ahead and remove this bolt. It's a 10mm socket. And all we're doing is keep the original bracket in place. We're adding this other bracket on top of it and reinstalling the bolt. Then flip the connector up, orient it the right way, and plug it in. And that part's done. At this point, we're ready to tighten everything up. We're going to go ahead and start at the front with the forward flange. Requires a 14mm socket, and both these and the muffler require a torque spec of 29 to 37 pound-feet of torque. Next, we're going to move on to the center clamp, but before we get that tight, we want to orient our center pipe. Now the goal here is to get the subframe hanger and the pipe hanger parallel with each other. And then once you're happy with it, hold it in place and tighten these guys. They require a 15mm socket. And as far as torque spec, you want them tight, really tight. The other thing to pay attention to is to make sure this clamp is still centered between the two pipes, so it has equal bite on both. Now I'm going to go ahead and skip this guy for now and get the muffler nuts tightened down. In this case, because it's the studs that come with our mid-pipe, it's a 17mm socket. And now for this last clamp, I want to orient it so it's not hanging down. It's a 13mm socket, just like that. And last but not least, our final step is to reinstall the aluminum braces. Use a 12mm socket and torque them to 14 to 19 foot-pounds. And we're done. Now we're ready to move on to installing the muffler. In this case, we have our Flyin Miata mid-pipe installed. There's a few subtle differences that we'll have to address, primarily just the hardware. The stock mid-pipe will use spring-loaded studs that require a 14mm socket to remove. In this case, we already have our hardware in there, which requires a 17mm socket. So we'll go ahead and undo the hardware, and then we'll fish the muffler out of the hangers. We've got the mid-pipe disconnected from the muffler. Now to get the bushings off the hangers, we're going to use a little lubrication, in this case Simple Green, or you can use WD-40, and a pry bar and a small block of wood, and we can pry the hangers off. The goal is to leave the rubber onto the chassis and remove them off the muffler. At this point, be ready to catch the muffler because there's nothing holding it on this side after we remove this bushing. The muffler's out. Now we're at the point of dealing with hardware. Now earlier in this video, I went over the differences between the gaskets and the hardware provided. So I'll go over it again really quick. If you are using the stock mid-pipe, you're going to use the stock hardware and the stock replacement gasket. The gasket is included with the Hush-o-matic. But since we're using a Flyin Miata mid-pipe, we're going to use the gasket and the hardware provided with the Flyin Miata mid-pipe. So I'm going to get that transferred from the old muffler to the new muffler. These studs don't have a shoulder. I just get them in to where they're just poking through the flange. And we'll reinstall this once we have the muffler in place. Now it's time to go ahead and install the muffler. Now we've left the rubber bushings in the car, so let's go ahead and feed it on one by one. And just make sure the end of the hanger is past the bushing so it latches on. Now we'll sneak the gasket in there and install the hardware. We'll tighten these nuts to 37 foot-pounds. Now if you're using our mid-pipe, you may consider loosening this clamp and retightening it after you have bolted on your muffler, just to make sure that nothing is binding. So we've installed the muffler. Now it's time to get the active component of it working. For that, we need to run a vacuum line supplied with the muffler from this actuator up to the front of the car. Find one end of your vacuum line, stick it on there. Now the goal is to use the zip ties and whatever else to get the vacuum line routed to where it's not going to get chafed or burnt or damaged in any other way. So make sure you're being aware of how it's resting. I usually get it up and over this forward hanger so it can go over the back of the rear subframe. All right, and then I'm going to zip tie it to the exhaust hanger that mounts to the chassis. This will keep it away from this sharp edge as well as the heat of the muffler. Now this might be hard to see, but I've got it routed up and over the charcoal canister breather line. That's just going to keep it away from the axles as they're rotating. We don't want it to get sucked up in those. And if you look up through here, I'll get it zip tied to this brake line since I can reach it, and it will further keep it away from the axle. Now I'm going to pull down this plastic shield to gain access to routing a little bit better. It's just held in place with 4 bolts that require a 10mm socket. Now in this area, I like to weave it around some of the lines, as that's kind of a method you can use to hold it. And I go ahead and take advantage of these factory clips that hold your brake lines and your fuel lines. So we're up to the front of the tunnel. Now the rest of this might be a little hard to show you on camera, but we're going to route this line up to the top of the chassis area, to the engine bay area, and you need to avoid things like the steering column and any sharp edges. So with what zip ties you have left over, make sure it gets tied off out of the way of harm. Okay, now we'll lower the car, get access to the front of that thing, and get it all plumbed in. So if you did not opt for one of the Hush-o-matic CAN controllers, the way you're going to control that actuator on the muffler is through engine vacuum. Now, to achieve that, step 1, find this vacuum line here, starting at the firewall on the driver's side. You're going to follow it down. It routes down and back into the back side of the intake manifold. Now, at the back side of the intake manifold, you are going to disconnect that line, and you are going to stick the end of the hose onto one end of this barbed fitting. So on the other side of the fitting is this jumper hose that's supplied. You can cut this down as necessary, and you're going to have it run in between the barbed fitting and back into the intake manifold. Now your third barb is small, and that's for the vacuum line. So you'll cut this down to length to where there's not an excess like there is now. You'll plumb it in. Make sure and zip tie everything up neatly so nothing is rubbing on anything to where it can chafe, because if this hose opens up, it will be a vacuum leak. So once you've done that, that wraps up your installation and you're done. And if you're going to do a Hush-o-matic CAN control kit, that's what we're doing next. So we'll show you how it's done. Now that we've installed the muffler, as well as the vacuum line from the muffler to the front of the car, we can go ahead and install the controller package. Now I'm going to go ahead and start at the bench by building the wiring harness for the relay. So let's go ahead and get started with that. I got a little bit of a head start and already separated my wire. You're going to be provided with 36 inches of dual lead wire. You're going to first separate the 2 leads, and then you're going to cut the wire into 4 8-inch sections and 2 15-inch sections. Color is not critical. And then I'm also going to separate out my spades that are included with the relay. Now, for the larger spades, there are 2 different sizes provided to you. The spades are the same size, but the accommodation for wiring gauge is different. I'm going to go ahead and use the smaller ones in this case. Let's get started with the crimping process. I'm going to take my 1 8-inch wire. I'm going to take my small spade. I'm going to strip the end of the wire. We're going to lay the wire into the spade where the bare wire is contained within the forward clamp and the insulation is contained in the secondary clamp. I will then crimp that closed. Give it a little yank to make sure it's on there as well. Now this one is going to go into our low pin position. So the relay comes with a decal to show you the various pins. So pay attention to the orientation of the blades. If you flip it over, you'll see L is next to 87, which is perpendicular to it. So if you flip it over, those 2 pins, this one here is L. Go ahead and remove the relay. And it can only go in one way, and it should click and lock. So you can see it's flush there at the surface. Now we'll move on to our other wires. Move on to another 8-inch wire, again with a small spade. Repeat that step. In some cases you might have left too much bare copper to where you can't get the insulation in that secondary clamp. So we'll go ahead and trim a little bit off and then crimp it. And this one is going to go into the H pin. So that's directly opposite of the low pin. So not that way, so we've got to flip it. All right, and you can see that one's now sitting in flush. Now we're going to move on to our third 8-inch wire, but this one's going into a large spade. And this one is going to go into pin 30. You can see on the diagram, pin 30 is one of the central pins, but it's the one that's perpendicular to both 87A and 87. So it's up at the top here. Figure out which way it needs to go in. Go till it clicks, and make sure it's flush at the top. Now, our first 15-inch wire. Same principle, get it clipped in. And this first 15-inch wire is going to install in pin 87. So that's in between the high and the low at the bottom. Now for our last two wires, we have an 8-inch and a 15-inch, and they are going to share a spade connector. I'm actually going to twist them together first. I just squeezed my insulation together a little bit more so it can fit in between those tangs there. Now we'll go ahead and get it crimped. All right, got that crimped into place. And this last one goes to pin 31, which is directly above the L. So if we get all lined up here again, L is this guy here, so we'll get it plugged in. And that is it for building the harness. Now we will need to keep track of which of these is which, so I recommend you refer to the diagram that's in the instructions or the diagram on the relay. So as we wire it in, we'll do a wire by wire and just make sure you get the right wire to the right position. At this point we can also plug in our relay. All set? All right, now we're going to move over to the car. Step 1, disconnect the negative battery terminal. Now we'll remove the fuse box lid. Be careful not to drag it on this metal edge here. Just a tab at the back, and then there's an overhang at the front. Set that aside. We want to disconnect these two electrical connectors and pop the harness out to make it a little easier. And we have this 10mm nut. Set the nut aside, and we have this zip tie, which we need to cut. All right, now our next step, we're trying to get the top of the fuse box off. We've undone most things we need. Now it's just being held on with a series of lock tabs that surround the perimeter of the entire fuse box. So one by one, we're going to just apply gentle upward pressure while we find those lock tabs and slowly pop them up. I missed one. There is one down in between the plastic here. There we go. And you can kind of just pull up on it a little bit to gain access to the underside, the nest of wires that exists down here. Now I'm going to maybe cut a few pieces of this tape that's kind of holding everything down. Make sure you're careful on what you're cutting. Make sure there's not a wire embedded in the tape. We're just trying to get a little ability to pull it up further. You can also open this door at the back because we'll be feeding wires underneath it here shortly. And that might be good enough for now. And now we're going to get our relay wired in underneath the fuse box. All right, now that we've got our fuse box lifted up, the next step is to actually wire in our MRS controller. Now the first thing we want to do is give it power. So we're going to locate our fuse labeled CU IG1. Now it's furthest away from the firewall, and it's this 15 amp one here. Now confirm it with the underside of your fuse box lid to make sure you're getting the right one. Now this next part I can't show you very well. It's hard to get the bottom side of this on camera because there's limited flexibility. But out of the bottom of this fuse is a brown wire. We're going to find that brown wire, and roughly in the middle of that wire, with plenty of length on either side, we're going to cut it in half. And we're going to take our relay wire from pin 30, make sure it's pin 30, and we're going to wire it back together with those two brown wires now with a 3-way butt connector. Make sure your crimp is good, and then you're going to also want to make sure that you end up heat shrinking these so you have a watertight and secure connection. Now you might wait until you're done with all your wiring before you apply your heat gun to shrink these. And the other thing to pay attention to is make sure with all the wires under here, please make sure you do not melt or overheat any of your other wires. So it's this wire here. Cut it in the middle. Now that we've got our power wire, the next wire to put in is our ground. Now we're going to locate the connector at the back of the fuse box, the larger of the two connectors. And on the underside, you'll find the cluster of wires coming out of it. Locate the black wire. Now we're working on an ND2, so our black wire is actually relatively thin. Be careful not to confuse these two black wires. One has a red stripe and one, which is hard to see, is a blue stripe. Don't grab those. Make sure it's the only black wire. On an ND1, it's a heavier gauge wire and it's right on the edge here. So again, we'll cut in the middle. We're going to take our wire from pin 31. Now that's the one that had the two wires coming out of it. And we're going to tee it in with a 3-way butt connector, just like we did on the first one. Okay. All right, we have power, we have ground. Now we need some CAN signals. So we're going to locate our CAN wires first. They are underneath the fuse box. There's a branch of wires closest to the engine. It's going to be a little tricky to see here, but they are going to be the only wires that are a twisted pair. They are black and blue and black and red. So I have them pulled up a little bit here. You do not want to tug them because you don't want to break them. But locate them. We're going to be cutting those and teeing in just like our power and ground. But instead of using 3-way butt connectors, we're using standard red butt connectors because these wires are so small. The 3-ways tend to be just a little bit too large. So we'll go ahead and do that now. I won't be able to show you too much on camera just because it's such limited access. If I didn't already mention, the black and blue wire is your CAN high wire, and that will match up with the H pin, and your black and red wire is your CAN low wire. That will match up with the wire from your L pin. So let's get started. All right, now we've got it done. Make sure you're getting your black and red with your black and red, your black and blue with your black and blue. Make sure you have it wired into the correct wires for your relay. If you accidentally flipped it, take the easy road and switch your pins at the relay. Don't try to cut this out and do it over, because as you've already learned, this isn't all that fun. So our last two wires, the 15-inch guys, are for the control solenoid. Now they're going to come out of the back of the fuse box here with this door that we opened. They're going to lay in some direction here. And they're going to hook up to our control solenoid, which comes with its own length of wire. As you can see, if we were to just join those together, we'd have a ton of wire. I like to do installations a little cleaner than that, so I'm going to actually assemble this at the bench, get it mounted where I want it, so I can trim my wires to a more appropriate length, and then get everything finalized with wiring. So we'll do that now. All right, now with the bench, we're going to hook up our solenoid to the mounting bracket and also hook up the vacuum fittings. There's a couple ways you can orient this. The way we show in the written instructions is to have it mounted upwards like this. I actually prefer to mount it down like this. Couple reasons. Number one, you're using this vacuum fitting and this vacuum fitting, which point toward their respective hoses, and your electrical is also low and tucked out of the way, so it's a nice clean way to do it. But you can do it whatever way you would prefer. So we're going to take our bolts, load it up with a washer. There's 4 washers, so 2 on each side, and we will get these started. Take our nuts, get them started. They are a nylock nut, so you'll just be able to get them started on there. Now with a 5.5 millimeter wrench or socket on the nut and a 2.5 millimeter Allen for the bolt, we will get this tightened up. All right, now onto the plumbing. Kit is provided with a small tube of thread sealant. Twist that off. Make sure it goes all the way around on at least a few of the threads. And it kind of rushes out if you're not careful. All right, 2 different fittings, 3 different ports. We're going to be using port 3 and 2. On port 3, we're going to install our larger barbed guide that's 90 degrees. You can use a 7/16 wrench to thread that in. As far as clocking of this fitting, you either want it pointing toward the top of the F on the FM logo, or you can have it pointing down toward the bottom of the solenoid if you're mounting the solenoid like I am, facing down. The other fitting, straight, goes into port number 2, and port number 1 stays open. Okay, just like that. Now we can get this installed in the car and finish the wiring. Now before we get this installed in the car, I'm going to go ahead and pre-install the wire loom and the heat shrink for the end of the wire loom, because this amount of wire is actually probably enough to reach into the fuse box with how we're going to mount it. And it's going to be more difficult to do afterward. So I'm going to pre-feed on the heat sleeve, find the seam in the insulation, leave the ends of the wires out just at the very end, and then shrink the sleeve down so it can go into the sleeve a little bit. Pull the wires until we're up to the solenoid. And using a heat gun, we'll shrink that down. Okay. Now we'll get this mounted in the car and finish up the wiring. It mounts using the rear stud for the ECU mounting bracket. So the stud closest to the firewall. Go ahead and get a socket on the 10 millimeter nut, break it loose, and we will install our solenoid over the stud and reinstall the factory nut. We'll feed our wiring underneath the ECU bracket. Get it pulled through. Now, like I said, in our case, our wires are long enough to reach into the box. So that's where we will do our butt connections so it's nice and clean. So we get the wire loom underneath the door here. Tight quarters, we're gonna squeeze it through. And get the door shut. So now we have our wires fed through, got our other wire ends. So I'll cut these guys short using the 2 remaining pink butt connectors. We'll get those connected. Polarity does not matter. I'm also going to cut off the excess loom. Now, I have not been heat shrinking the butt connectors along the way, so I'm going to go ahead and do all of that now. Again, the reminder is, be very careful with heat. Do not melt your other wires. So in areas where you can't really avoid getting heat on your other wires, you might use an insulating piece of metal to keep direct heat off of the other wires. So I just found this piece of metal in our scrap bin. That way the heat reflects back into the butt connector and not on to the wires sitting behind. But then be careful because the metal could be a little warm. All right, that wraps up the electrical. So now we just need to put our fuse box together. We're going to go ahead and stash our controller underneath the fuse box. It is tight. We've found that it's easiest to do it closest to the engine. And the key when you're putting your fuse box back together is to not pinch any of these wires. So pay extra attention as you're doing that. It can take some trial and error to get it just right. So just try different positions until you can get it to snap into place. So we'll do that now. Okay, we're all snapped back together. So at this point we can plug in our harness, install our nut, reinstall our lid. And since we're done with the electrical now, we can go ahead and hook up the battery again. Now all that's left is the vacuum plumbing. So we need to be able to provide the solenoid with a vacuum source. Now the cleanest way to do that is to remove this vacuum cap on the side of the rail on the passenger side. Now take a pair of pliers, move the clamp, break the grip loose. You also hear some vacuum escaping because this rail stays under vacuum. Now take the supplied small length of hose. It's a tight fit, so you might even lubricate it with a little simple green, something that will dry up. Now we can feed the clamp back on. Using the supplied union, we'll put the larger end into this hose. Now the larger vacuum hose. Now we need to run this to the driver's side of the engine bay. So I'm going to run it across the top of the rail here, zip tying it to make sure it stays away from sharp edges and anything that could chafe. And then I'll trim it to fit over the port on the solenoid. And we'll trim all of our zip tie tails. Now the last step is to hook up the line that routes to the muffler that we installed earlier. So as we have drawn it up from the bottom of the car, we just want to make sure that it's not going to rub on anything, chafe on anything that will end up opening it up. So as necessary, you might zip tie it to something that will keep it stable and away from chafe and sharp edges. We'll route it up to the port and trim the hose to length. And that wraps up the install. All right, now that we've got all the parts installed, I'm gonna go ahead and show you how to control the Hush-o-matic. So the Hush-o-matic muffler is controlled via the intermittent selector wheel of your wiper stock. It's only going to apply changes to the muffler if you are in the off, low, or high settings. If you're in the auto or the intermittent settings, depending on your model, it will not apply changes to the muffler. So let's go over the selector wheel. Think of it as a volume knob. If you're at the negative sign, you're all the way quiet. At this setting, you will never have that valve open. No matter what throttle you give it, it will always be shut. The next detent, it will remain shut until you've achieved 90% throttle. So if you've given 90% throttle or more, that valve will open, bypassing the muffler. The next detent is your 60% throttle or greater. The next detent is 20% throttle or greater. And if you're all the way to the plus, that's when your exhaust will be all the way open all the time, regardless of throttle. Hey everyone, thanks for watching as we installed this Flyin Miata Hush-o-matic exhaust system. If you have any questions during your install, please don't hesitate to send us an email or give us a call. And if you like this video, please like and subscribe, as we'll be doing more videos like this in the future. Thanks again for watching. Have a great day.